I've been on hiatus, so it's been a little while. So if you've been missing the videos or podcasts, whatever, I apologize for that. But I'm here to tell you about a couple of upcoming projects, both video related and then some stuff on the website, and then non-science fiction related. All right, so first, let me talk about my sci-fi Christian related projects. First, over the next 3 to 4 weeks, it'll be probably a 4-week series, with hopefully the first one coming out later this week. I'm going to do a series on fantasy novels and academia, called Fantasy in the Academy. And there's going to be an introduction series. We're going to kind of spell out the idea, or an introduction video where I'll spell out the idea in more detail. And then for the next 3 episodes in the series, I'm going to talk about a different fantasy series and the academic disciplines that relate to it. So the goal being to understand some of our favorite series more in depth, become more intelligent readers, and in general just appreciate fantasy as a meaningful genre rather than something to just have fun. So we're going to be looking at Lord of the Rings, obviously, Song of Ice and Fire, and then probably the one a lot of people are not as familiar with, the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson, which has a lot of interesting things to say regarding sociology and anthropology. So look for that. Then out on the website, thesciencefichristian.com. I said that kind of goofy, so let me say it again. thescifichristian.com. I am writing a series of articles. The first one went up yesterday, as you are seeing this, in which I am going to be kind of talking about literature and literary appreciation. The first one talks about how e-reading has the potential to revolutionize our interaction with classical literature. The next one's going to talk about the challenge of literary appreciation and how we ought to evaluate classical literature different than other books. And then the final one will talk about the problem of accessibility in many works of classical literature, and what do we do when classical works are difficult to read. I also have a article series in the back of my mind for later on. Let me turn off my sound on my computer so we don't keep getting Facebook dings in the background there. And I don't know when this is going to be coming. We're probably going to do a podcast episode on it, at least at a high level, and then flesh it out more in the articles. But I want to do a series of articles based on some of the origins of stuff in Tolkien, so some of his influences in classical literature. So, for example, there's stuff from Dante, there's stuff from Shakespeare, there's a bunch of subtle and significant references throughout Tolkien's work. Tons of stuff from classical mythology, of course, since that really was his forte, or one of his fortes. So, kind of interesting series to look at some of the literary origins of Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's other works. Okay, so look for that sometime in 2015. And then finally, what I'm really here to tell you guys about today and to preview for you is a YouTube series I'm going to be doing that's not going to be part of the Sci-Fi Christian because it doesn't have anything to do with sci-fi or fiction in general. I am reading through Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, which is incredibly long, incredibly dense theological work. It is probably the most significant theological work outside for Christians anyway, outside of the Bible. It's highly influential, most influential on Catholics, but also on Protestants, Christians of all stripes, and really has a lot to say about philosophy. You know, it's been influential on secular philosophy, on our understanding of psychology, so even if you're not a Christian, it's a book worth reading. So I'm going to be, the book is just massive. You kind of see behind me here, I've got 5 volumes, all are very, very thick. There are 600 different questions that make up the Summa, each question being extremely dense in terms of theology and philosophical value. So over the next few years, and that's probably how long it's going to take, I'm going to be going through the Summa a question at a time, and we're going to be talking about that. I have a ongoing outline that I'm going to be taking notes in and providing as part of that series, which I provided a link to that in the video description here, so you can check that out. So that's going to be the separate series. But before I got into the questions itself, I recorded a few introductory videos. One is just kind of on the series in general. One is on who Thomas Aquinas was and why you should care. And then the third is on the structure of the Summa. 3 short videos. I've edited them together for you. And so I want to give the sci-fi Christian audience a preview of this. If you like what you see, please follow along. You can like me on Facebook, all that. It should be a very fascinating and interesting journey, if for no one else, then at least for me. It's one of those series where even if nobody watches, the value to myself is just going to be enormous. But if you're interested in philosophy, theology, or just becoming a more well-rounded human being, worth your time to maybe check this out. So, take a look. Here are my introductory pieces to my Reading the Summa YouTube series. Hey everyone, Ben DiBono here with my latest YouTube/podcasting venture. This one, I gotta be honest, is really gonna be more for myself that I'm doing this than for anyone else. So hopefully some people will watch this and maybe even benefit from it. But I'm doing this for myself because I want to read the Summa Theologica. I have read several sections of it, but I want to read it, and not only read it, but understand it. And I've found with myself that one of the best ways to do that, of course, is to teach it. Not that I'm actually qualified to teach something as great as Thomas Aquinas, but hopefully in disciplining myself to record some brief videos of the Summa as we go along, it will help my comprehension of it and force me to actually get into it and truly understand what the angelic doctor is saying to us in this most important of works. So these are going to be short videos, no more than a few minutes each, and we're going to do a couple introductory ones. Next one's going to be on the life of Thomas Aquinas, who he was, why you should care. Then we're going to talk about the structure of the Summa, and then finally we'll get into the Summa itself in the 4th video, and we'll just go question by question through it, 1 video per question. Okay, the goal of these videos is not going to be an extensive understanding of St. Thomas' work. It's going to be a basic comprehension. So I'm not trying to necessarily lay out every last nuance of the Summa. I'm not trying to lay out an expert opinion because, well, I do have some formal education in theology at the postgraduate level. Or at the graduate level, I have a couple masters in theology. I'm by no means an expert in Thomas Aquinas. It's an incredibly difficult book, as anyone who has ever attempted to read it or actually read it knows, but yet one very much worth doing. So the goal is going to be basic comprehension, not expertise and not debate or evaluation. So whether or not you or I or whoever agrees with every last word of the Summa is kind of irrelevant. The point is to actually understand what we're reading. So to that end, of course, if there are any errors I make, or I should say when there are errors that I make along the way, please feel free to offer correction in the comments as we go. So a couple of things that we're going to be doing as far as the tricks of the trade here, or the tools I'm going to be using. One of the things I think is key in reading the Summa is making sure that the terminology he uses is understood, because that can be very difficult. So to that end, for each question, as different terms come up that are maybe unusual, we'll make sure to define those, and then we'll go through the articles quickly one at a time to explain what he is trying to say. As far as defining terminology, I've got a couple of sources that I'm going to be using here. I just picked up this excellent and hefty resource, the Lexicon of St. Thomas Aquinas, for I think it's mostly the Summa, but it probably covers his whole work. So, Fortunately, a lot of it, you probably can't see that very well, hold it up there, but a lot of it's in Latin, which I don't speak much Latin or read much Latin, but you can figure out what the basic word is to look up what you want to look up, and then thankfully they have kind of a definition, short explanation that's in English, so that's proven very helpful to me in figuring out, what exactly does he mean by, the divine notions versus the divine essence versus the divine substance, and all these heavily nuanced terms that are quite confusing. And then we have here, I have another Thomas Aquinas dictionary that I'm going to be referring to. This is from Morris Stockhammer, compiled this. And what this is it just will have different terms. Again, it's not nearly as extensive, but then it will have a reference or a quote from the Summa where Aquinas uses that term in what is hopefully an explanatory way. So, he's got I'm looking at the F's here, face, faculty, faith, just get a sense of how St. Thomas was using that phrase. And then, in addition, of course, to the Summa itself there, I'm also going to be making use of Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange's commentaries on the Summa. And I've seen, this is just the first one. I mean, this 700-page book goes through the first 26 questions. And that's proven quite helpful to me as well in terms of my comprehension of the Summa as well. I'm going to be using, of course, other books, other on St. Thomas, good old Google, of course. Chesterton has a great book on Aquinas that I want to check out, and so we'll use some of those tips along the way. But that stuff, the lexicon, the commentary, and the Summa itself are going to be the main sources that I will be using to aid in my comprehension and help with these videos. All right, so that's it for the introduction. Next time we'll talk about who St. Thomas was and why you should care about him and the Summa. Goodbye. Hi everyone, Benny Bono here, talking to you about who Thomas Aquinas was and why you should care. Well, St. Thomas is arguably the most important figure in Catholic and Christian theology outside of the writers of Scripture and Christ himself, of course. He is writing the Summa, the Summa Theologica, which is what we're going to be reading and going through, is arguably the most influential book of the Christian faith outside of sacred Scripture itself. So, as far as why you should care about it, well, if you're a Catholic like myself, you care whether you realize it or not, because the Summa has been incredibly influential on Catholic theology over the last 800 years. If you're a Christian who's not a Catholic, you should care because it's also been influential on your theology, whether you realize it or not. Even, especially if you're a Protestant, St. Thomas wrote before the Reformation, so his influence is very much felt also in the Protestant traditions. If you're not a Christian at all and are just interested in religious thought, you should care because, again, this is one of the most important religious works ever written. If you're interested in philosophy, you should care because it's one of the most important philosophical works ever written. If you're just a human being, you should care because St. Thomas has a great deal to say about your condition, and his thought has been influential whether you agree with him or not. So, in short, everyone should care about the Summa. It's that important of a work. It really is. It's that influential, that foundational to the understanding of Western theology, Western thought, and Western philosophy. Okay, it's a seminal work in all of those areas. All right, so who was St. Thomas? Well, St. Thomas was born in 1225, died in 1274. He was canonized in 1323, very, very recently after his death, relatively speaking. He was a Dominican friar and a priest, but primarily his work revolved around his intellectual pursuits. His two greatest works are the Summa Contra Gentiles and the Summa Theologica, or Summa Theologiae as it's often called. He also wrote commentaries on the works of Aristotle, who highly, highly influenced his thought, and various other treatises and books on a number of topics pertaining to both philosophy and theology. He had a vision a year before his death while working on the third part of the Summa, in which he claimed that he had revealed to him many divine mysteries. And at that time he stopped writing, and he said, as far as why he stopped writing, he's quoted as saying, "Such things have been revealed to me that all I have written seems to me as so much straw. Now I await the end of my life." Very profound statement from one of the most brilliant men who have ever written, and I think an important lesson on being humble with what we believe and what we read, even in something as great as the Summa, that this incredibly difficult and influential and important book is at the end of days just straw as compared to the beatific vision that St. Thomas was given a taste of. St. Thomas was dubbed the dumb ox, a loving but teasing nickname by his teacher St. Albert the Great, likely because of his large size and shy personality. However, St. Albert, despite this gentle ribbing, had this to say. He said, "We call this man a dumb ox, but his bellowing in doctrine will one day resound throughout the world." And of course, St. Albert is quite right. Thomas Aquinas is one of the doctors of the Church. Indeed, he's referred to often as the angelic or holy doctor in Catholic writing. He has been influential on numerous popes. He's been influential on numerous, virtually every Catholic theologian who has followed him afterwards. His writing is quoted in the councils and in the encyclicals of the Church. He is a foundational doctor who stands really head and shoulders even above the greats such as St. Augustine himself. As I said earlier, really his work is probably the most important and influential in Catholic thought outside of sacred scripture. It's that important. So, that's a bit for you of who we're going to be reading about, why we're going to care about what he had to say and all that, and I'll be back next time to talk about the structure of the Summa. Goodbye. Hello everyone, Ben DeBoto here to talk to you about the structure of the Summa Theologica. Summa is a very highly organized book, which is why understanding its structure is very important if you're going to understand the work as a whole. Thomas Aquinas was a very logical thinker, as anybody who's read more than about 2 words of the Summa can attest to. It's a difficult book, but also a very logical and organized book. So understanding its organization is essential. The Summa is, at its highest level, divided into 3 parts. The first part treats primarily God, and the second part treats primarily man, and the third part, which was uncompleted, it treats man's relation to God, forming a circle so that the entire thing becomes cyclical, everything flowing out of God and back into him. The 3 parts are in turn divided into several treatises. For example, in the first part we begin with what is probably the shortest treatise in the entire Summa. It's composed of only 1 question. I'll get to the questions in just a second. The treatise on sacred doctrine. From there we move on to the treatise of the one God, followed by the treatise on the persons of the Trinity. And finally on the treatise of, or not finally, but next on the treatise on angelic beings, and so on and so forth. Several treatises, each a collection of several questions that make up that together compose Thomas Aquinas' thoughts on the subject at hand of the treatise. I'm going to pull out my first volume here just so I can kind of, I know it doesn't show very well on there, but so I can kind of read what I mean by some of the questions. So then within those 38 treatise, then, there are 631 questions, and each question composes a different aspect of the treatise. So in the first treatise, The Nature of Sacred Doctrine, well, the question is simply, what is the nature and extent of sacred doctrine? But if we move on from there and we talk about the treatise on the one God, then we have, for example, does God exist is one of the questions. Is God perfect? Is God good? What does it mean to call God God? What does it mean when we say God is eternal? So altogether then, when we answer all those questions, are going to come together and give us a view of St. Thomas's view on God as one. Okay? So then we move on down a level from there, and within each question is a series of articles, sometimes only a couple, sometimes quite a few. For example, to again use the treatise on sacred doctrine, we have 10 different articles in that one. One of the longer questions in the Summa, at least in terms of number of articles. So the articles then are going to be different parts of the question. You kind of see how we're going here. So the first article, the first question, why is anything besides philosophy required? In other words, why do we need sacred doctrine if we have just natural reasoning? What purpose does this serve? Second article, is sacred doctrine a science? Is it one science? Is it a practical science? Is it a noble science? It's on and on it goes. Each article then giving us a full vision of the question. Within the articles, then, so there are about roughly 3,000 articles within the 631 questions. Within the articles, then, that is itself organized into several parts. When you begin an article, well, the first thing you will notice is a series of objections. So, it'll be, in the first article, objection 1, and then there's a paragraph detailing the first objection. Objection 2, sometimes there can be as many as 5, 6, 7 different objections. The objections will be things, for example, here in that first one, whether, why do we need theology when we have rationality and philosophy? The first objection is going to be on the lines of, well, it says in the Bible not to seek things that are too high above you, and obviously the divine nature is above us, so why should we seek that? Philosophy already treats the existence of God. That's a philosophical category. Why do we need theology in addition to it? So Thomas Aquinas is going to go on from the objections, and he'll open with a brief statement that usually begins, on the contrary. And here he'll more often than not include either a quote from Scripture or a quote from one of the doctors of the church, such as Augustine. Sometimes he will offer his own thoughts, sometimes he'll quote a more philosophical source, but usually it will be Scripture or a doctor of the church. That's usually very brief, so a single paragraph, and it can even be shorter than that. On the contrary, he then moves into his own article, which begins with, I answer that, and he'll then lay out his case. Now, so for example, we have the objection that it doesn't seem like anything's required beyond philosophy. Theology is superfluous. Well, his on the contrary is from 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture is inspired by God, is profitable to teach, to reprove, to correct, to instruct in justice. He then, in his I answer that, fleshes that out and makes a logical argument for why theology is needed in addition to philosophy. After his article, then, he will reply to each of the objections in turn. So, we have reply to objection 1, which is going to meet up with objection 1. Reply to objection 2, that's going to meet up with objection 2, and on it goes. If you're struggling to read the Summa, a couple different ways that can be helpful to tackle this within that structure. Sometimes it's helpful to read the main body of his article first, and then go back and read objection 1, then read the reply to objection 1, then read objection 2, then read reply to objection 2. What can sometimes happen is you read objection 1, then you make your way through the entire article, and by the time you get down here to the answer to objection 1, you've completely forgotten what the objection was in the first place. You know, another method that can work is to kind of skim the objections, get an idea of what's at stake here, then go back, you know, then go on, read through the article, then go back and reread the objection, reread the answer. Play around with the reading style that works for you with the Summa. The other thing that's important to realize is that the questions of the Summa, for the most part, are going to build on one another, okay? So, this first article, or even the articles within the questions, are going to build on one another, I should have said. This first article, the objection is, it doesn't seem like anything other than natural reason is required. And then Aquinas is going to answer that and make the argument that no theology is required in addition to philosophy or natural reason. Okay, so at that point, every other question and article in the Summa, that position is going to be assumed. That fact has now been established within St. Thomas's argument, and so we'll build on that. So then the next article, is sacred doctrine a science, assumes that sacred doctrine is a real study and a necessary study. Okay, and the objection there is going to be, it doesn't seem like a science, and I'll explain what all that means when we go through this first question in the next video. And then he answers that and argues that no, it is a science. Okay, so the third article is going to be whether sacred doctrine is one science. And so you see how that goes. You know, we're building one on top of another, making a layered, rational argument. Almost think of it, a helpful way to think of the Summa, and I don't think this is original to me, though I can't remember where I first heard it, is to think of the Summa as the building of a cathedral. Okay? It is building of a great and glorious work dedicated to God. And in reading the Summa, you are examining brick by brick by brick that which comes together to form the whole cathedral. All the parts interdependent upon one another, built on one another, in order to give us this glorious work dedicated to God, which is what a cathedral is, and which is what the Summa Theologica is. All right, so that's the structure of the Summa. Next time we will get into the first question itself, the nature of sacred doctrine. Goodbye. So there you have it. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and if you liked what you saw, again, check me out on YouTube, Reading the Summa. Link is in the description to that. Check out my Facebook page for the show. Link is also in the description for that. Always follow along in the outline. As you can see right now, it's not very complete, but I'm going to be building that as we go, and it'll eventually become quite a massive overview of the Summa, but hopefully one that is more accessible than the Summa itself, which is, of course, quite dense. All right, everyone. Thanks for taking a look at that, and I will see you hopefully later this week with my first video on fantasy and the academy. But that is all for now. This is Bendy Bono. Goodbye.